There is a place in the northwest of the Kalahari called Dobe. The sand there is pale, and the trees stand well apart from one another. The country there is dry for most of the year, though it is not the empty desert that the word Kalahari tends to suggest. There are mongongo trees, which grow tall and produce a hard-shelled nut in great quantity. There are patches of grass, and there is a waterhole that gives the place its name. In the middle of the day, the light is flat and white, and the shade under the trees is the only thing worth having. In the early morning, it is cold enough that people sit close to the fires until the sun has come properly up. People have lived in that country for a very long time. The ones who were living there in the middle of the 20th century call themselves the Juhuanzi. Older books call them Bushmen, and older books than that call them worse things. In July of 1964, a young Canadian anthropologist arrived at that waterhole with a truck, a set of scales, and a supply of notebooks. His name was Richard Porcher-Lee, and he had come to count. What he counted and what he did not count is the subject of everything that follows. It took him 4 weeks to gather the numbers, and it took the rest of the century for the world to finish arguing about them. The argument is still going on in a quiet way, in journals that very few people read. It has changed shapes several times since he first published. This is an account of that measurement and of the work it did not see. It moves slowly and it does not arrive anywhere in particular. The people in it spent their lives paying attention to small things, and it keeps returning to that same quiet country in the Kalahari. The question Lee had come to answer had been sitting unanswered in European thought for around 300 years. The received account of human life before agriculture was that it had been miserable. People were held to have lived close to starvation, moving constantly, unable to accumulate anything and dying young. Philosophers had said so, and the phrase most often repeated described such a life as poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Textbooks repeated it well into the 1960s, and it was taught to school children as settled fact, rather than as an inference nobody had tested. What is interesting about that account is not that it was wrong. It is that nobody had checked it. The claim had been made about people who were in many cases still alive and still living that way. In 3 centuries, no one had thought to sit beside them with a watch and see how the days actually went. Lee decided to sit beside them with a watch. His method was simple, and simplicity is usually a sign that a method will be useful. It is also a sign that the method has edges nobody notices. Each morning, he recorded which adults left the camp. Each evening, he recorded when they came back. He weighed the food they carried in on a scale. He converted those weights into calories. In that way, at the end of 4 weeks, he would have not an impression, but a set of figures. He was also, at that time, the only source of tobacco for 1,000 square miles. He kept about 2 months of tinned food in his truck. The people he was living among rarely had a day's food in hand. He was aware of the gap, and it made him uncomfortable. He wrote later that they resented his presence at the waterhole and at the same time dreaded his leaving. One further thing about the place is worth setting down before the numbers arrive. The objection to all of this comes quickly, and it is a fair one. The Juhuanzi of 1964 were not a window onto the Paleolithic. They were people of the 20th century, living where they lived in part because farmers and herders had taken the better country several generations earlier. Every foraging group that anthropology has ever studied has been in that position, and nobody has ever observed a Stone Age day, and nobody ever will. What a camp of that kind can offer is the physics of the problem. How long it takes a human body to turn a landscape into a meal, using hands and simple tools. That much carries across, and very little else does. The food he weighed was mostly not meat. The center of the diet at Dobe was the mongongo nut. It falls in enormous quantities across that region and lies on the ground for months without spoiling. Nobody plants it and nobody tends it. A woman walking out in the morning could gather enough in a single day to feed her family for 3. This was not a good day, but an ordinary one. He watched that happen, and then watched it happen again, until it stopped seeming remarkable and became simply the way the place worked. The figure Lee arrived at was 12 to 19 hours a week. It is worth saying that number slowly. A great deal was built on top of it, and very little of what was built ever went back to check the foundation. That was the time it took an adult at Dobe to bring in all the food the camp required. It comes out at something like 2.5 working days, and the remainder of the week was not spent on subsistence at all. People rested in camp and visited other camps and received visitors. A great deal of energy went into the long conversations about obligation and gift that hold such a society together. In the spring of 1966, a symposium met in Chicago to gather together everything that was then known about people who lived without farming. It had been given the title Man the Hunter. Lee presented his Kalahari figures there, and other researchers presented comparable numbers from Australia and from South America. The numbers kept landing in the same general territory, 15 hours a week and 20, somewhere between 3 and 5 hours a day for each adult. Among those present was Marshall Solins, and he was not a field worker and had never weighed a mongongo nut. What he possessed instead was a gift for the sentence that survives its evidence. Solins took the tables and built an argument on them. Affluence, he said, means that your wants are satisfied, and there are 2 roads to that condition. You can produce enormously, which is the road industrial societies have taken, or you can want very little, which was the road these societies had taken. Both arrive at the same place, and on that reasoning, the people Lee had been watching were not poor at all. He gave them a name that has outlasted almost everything else in this story. He called them the original affluent society. The phrase appeared in his book, Stone Age Economics, published in 1972, and it spread far beyond anthropology within a few years. It is worth being clear about what it was aimed at, because the aim was decent. The older account of foraging life had done a great deal of work in the world, and not innocent work. It had been used to justify taking land from people on the grounds that they were not using it properly. It was used to justify schools that beat languages out of children on the grounds that those children were being raised out of savagery. Lee and Solins put measured evidence through the middle of that account, and the world was better for it. The phrase also arrived at a moment that was ready to receive it. A good many people in Europe and North America were then asking whether industrial life was worth what it cost. Here was what looked like evidence from the deep past that it was not. That combination of a clean number and a receptive audience is how an idea travels, and this one traveled a long way. The definition Lee had used is written down in his publications, and it is not hidden, and it is the place where this whole account turns. Work for the purpose of that count meant time spent outside the camp acquiring food. A person walked out, gathered or hunted, and walked back, and the clock ran from the departure to the return. Lee said so plainly, and he argued that it was the right definition for the question he was asking. That was whether the food quest was a desperate one. Measured in that way, it plainly was not. Consider then what that clock does not run for. It does not run when a load of mongongo nuts is set down in the shade, and the nuts at that point are not food. Each one has a hard outer husk, and beneath that, an inner shell about as yielding as a river pebble. Reaching the kernel means building a fire and roasting and cracking each nut with a hammerstone against another stone and picking the meat out afterwards. That is done several hundred times for a single meal by women sitting together, talking, while the fire is kept going by somebody else. It does not run while a hide is worked. An animal comes into camp whole. Between that animal and a carrying cross that will hold 40 pounds of nuts lies several days of work, skinning, then scraping, then working the skin soft against the knuckles. The sinew for stitching has to be prepared before any of the stitching can begin. It does not run while somebody twists cord or shapes a digging stick. It does not run while an arrow is straightened and pointed and fletched. It does not run while the poison for that arrow is prepared. It does not run for firewood, and that is fetched daily and which runs out near a camp. In that way, the walk lengthens week by week until the camp itself must move. It does not run for water. It does not run for the ostrich eggshell beads that are made and strung and given away across an enormous network of relationships. That is the only insurance anybody in that country has against a year when the rains fail. It does not run for children. They are carried and watched and fed and taught continuously by mothers and grandmothers and older sisters, while every other task goes on around them. Lee described a good deal of this in print. In his own account of the same camp, he wrote that a woman gathers on one day enough food for 3 days. She then spends the rest of her time resting in camp, doing embroidery, visiting other camps and entertaining visitors. That for each day at home, the kitchen routines occupy 1 to 3 hours of her time. 1 to 3 hours every day spent at home, and the word placed in front of that sentence is resting. There is a reason the interior of the camp went uncounted, and it has nothing to do with anyone's opinion of the people doing the work. A departure has a shape, and a man walks out at first light carrying a bow. There is a clean beginning and a clean end, an accountable outcome. It involves one person doing one thing. An observer sitting in the shade with a notebook can record that perfectly, and can record 11 of them in a morning without difficulty. Cracking nuts has no shape at all, and it begins when somebody sits down. A child interrupts it, and it resumes, and a sister takes over for a while. It moves nearer the fire and back again. It ends when the bowl is full, and nobody in the camp could tell you how long it took either. That is because nobody in the camp was measuring. There would be no reason for them to. One man with a pencil cannot follow 11 people into 11 shelters at the same time. Field methods bend quietly and permanently toward whatever a single observer is able to watch. That bend is not confined to the Kalahari, and it is not confined to anthropology. nearly every figure anyone has ever been handed about how human beings spend their time has come out of a method with an edge somewhere. The things that were happening off to the side of that edge did not stop happening. They simply stopped counting as data, which is a different thing entirely. Lee returned to this himself some years later and did the sum a second way. In his book on the Zhuhuanzi, published in 1979, he added food processing back into the total. He added tool manufacture and repair, and he added the ordinary housework of a camp, the nut cracking and the firewood and the water. The revised figure for men came out at 44.5 hours a week. For women, it came out at 40 and 1/10. He published those numbers under his own name in the book that made his reputation. He then argued about what they meant, and his argument was a fair one. A wage earner in North America also spends something like 40 hours beyond the job itself, on housework and shopping and the rest of it. In that way, comparing like with like leaves, the Zhuhuanzi still ahead on genuine free time. That is a considerably more complicated sentence than 15 hours a week, and it never traveled anything like as far. The correction was published and read and cited, and the original figure went on being repeated in places where the correction never reached. Almost everything a human being makes is made of material that rots: wood and bark, and hide and grass, and gut and fiber, all go into the ground and are gone within a few centuries. What remains behind is stone and bone. Together, those two form a small and badly misleading sample of any life that was ever lived. The archaeologist Linda Hercomb has a name for the part that disappears. She calls it the missing majority. It is a useful exercise to apply that to a house one knows. Remove from it everything made of cloth, leather, wood, paper, rope, or food. Leave behind only the metal and the ceramic and the glass, and then break most of what is left. A stranger asked to reconstruct a week from the remainder would arrive at some strange conclusions. That stranger would probably decide the household had been unusually preoccupied with cutlery. Occasionally, the ground returns a piece of the missing part. One such piece was published in the year 2020 by a team led by Bruce Hardy of Kenyon College. It came from Abri du Maras, a rock shelter in a valley near the Ardèche in the south of France. The layer it came from is dated to between 41 and 52,000 years ago. That places it well before the arrival of modern humans in that region, in a valley occupied by Neanderthals. The object is a fragment of cord about 6 millimeters long and 0.5 millimeter wide, small enough to be lost in a fingerprint. Nobody dug for it, because nothing of that size can be dug for. It came off a flint flake that had already been excavated and bagged and catalogued. It was found because somebody put that flake under a microscope and looked at the residue rather than at the working edge. Under magnification, it resolves into 3 separate bundles of fiber. Somebody twisted each bundle in one direction, then they twisted all 3 together in the opposite direction. That is the construction of every piece of string in every kitchen drawer in the world. The fibers come from the inner bark of a conifer. Follow what that requires of the person who made it. They knew which trees carry usable bast beneath the bark. They knew that the bark separates cleanly only in spring and early summer. This means they had to be near those trees when the season opened. They soaked the harvest and drew it apart into strands. Then they twisted against the twist and that is because a single twisted strand simply unwinds itself. The only thing that prevents that is a second strand pulling the other way. Before this fragment, there were hints of such things in the form of individual twisted fibers on tools from the same shelter. Hints are all they were, and a three-ply cord is not a hint. It is a technique held in a head and a pair of hands and taught to somebody else. Hardy and his colleagues make one further observation about it. Keeping track of plies and counterplies means holding sets and pairs in mind, and that sits close to the beginnings of number. Once cord exists, a great deal becomes possible that was not possible before. Bags can be made, and nets, and snares, and mats, and clothing that fits a body rather than hanging on it. A stone point can be bound to a wooden shaft and stay bound. A carrying sling can hold an infant against a woman's side. That is the difference between a mother who can gather food and a mother who cannot. None of those objects survive from that period anywhere, for the simple reason that they consisted of the things that rot. Cord also has a second property, which is that it never stops needing attention. It frays and it stiffens and it breaks. Nets tear, and bindings work loose and have to be cut away and replaced. A snare set today is a snare to be checked tomorrow. Every object in a shelter that is held together by fiber is an object that will require mending within a season. That is not a discovery somebody made once. It is a permanent condition running quietly beneath every life in every camp, for as long as people have lived in camps at all. We named a whole era after stone, and the reason we named it after stone is that stone is the material that happened to last. There is a further thought in the Abri du Maras paper worth setting down here, which is that the cord does not stand alone. Over the past 20 years, a series of finds from Neanderthal sites has pushed in the same direction. Birch bark tar was being produced, and tar is not something anybody arrives at by accident. That is because the bark must be heated, with the air kept away from it, and held at temperature while the tar is collected. Eagle talons were being strung, and pigment was being worked. Shell beads appear. Every one of those discoveries arrived as a surprise. Every one of them arrived because somebody looked more closely at material that had been sitting in a drawer for years. The direction of that pattern is worth noticing, and it is consistent. Each time the methods improve, the deep past becomes more complicated rather than simpler. Nobody has yet dug up evidence that our predecessors were doing less than we had supposed, and it seems increasingly unlikely that anybody ever will. To see what a working day actually contained, one would want a person interrupted in the middle of it, and prehistory almost never provides that. A grave provides the opposite, and it provides what the living chose to place beside the dead. That is a curated arrangement rather than a working inventory. The difference between those two things is considerable. There is one exception. He was found in September of 1991 by two hikers crossing a ridge in the Ötztal Alps on the border between Austria and Italy. He was melting out of a glacier. He died in the early summer, somewhere between 3,300 and 3,100 years before the Common Era. He was around 45 years old and about 5 feet 2 inches tall. Nobody laid him out, and nobody chose what went with him. He had been walking at altitude with everything he happened to be carrying, and the ice took the whole arrangement exactly as it stood. What he was carrying is worth going through slowly. because it is the only working inventory of its kind in existence. He had an axe with a copper blade bound to a U-handle, and copper in that century was not a common material. He had a flint dagger about 13 centimeters long with a handle of ash wood and a sheath made from lime bast. The blade is small for its sheath because it had been resharpened many times over. He had a kit for making fire with flint and pyrite for the spark and tinder fungus to catch it. He had 2 containers of birch bark, and he had leggings of domestic goat hide cross-stitched together with animal sinew. He had a loosely meshed net of tree bast string, most likely for taking birds or hares. He had a tool for reworking stone edges. That is a shaft of lime wood with an antler tip set into it and sharpened to a point like a pencil. Beneath his clothing, he carried 61 tattoos, arranged in 19 groups, made as short lines of charcoal rubbed into small incisions. They cluster on the lower back and the knees and the ankles and the wrists. These are the places where his own bones show wear. A good many researchers believe they were therapeutic rather than decorative. Whatever their purpose, somebody spent hours making them, and nobody was going to see them under those clothes. And on his back, he carried a quiver of chamois hide, 86 centimeters long, which remains the only Neolithic arrow case anyone has ever recovered. Inside it were 14 arrows, of which 2 could be shot. The other 12 were shafts, without points and without fletching, raw stock in various stages of preparation. The bow was a stave of yew, 1 meter 82 long. It had been cut fresh from a tree, 8 to 10 centimeters thick, and worked with an axe from both directions. It was not finished. It still needed shortening and thinning and polishing, and it needed knocks cut at the ends to take a string. The bow shoots best at roughly the height of the archer using it. He was 5 feet 2, so a considerable part of the shaping remained to be done. Coiled in the quiver, wound into a neat S shape, and knotted at the end was a cord of 3 twisted strands of animal sinew. It is the oldest known bowstring in the world, older than the next surviving example by about 1,000 years. He had the string wound and knotted and stowed in the quiver, and he did not yet have a finished bow to put it on. That state of affairs is the point, and it is easy to walk past. An inventory, read as a list of possessions, gives the impression of a man fully equipped for the mountains. Read as a snapshot of work in progress, it gives something quite different. Here's a man in the middle of several jobs at once, carrying them uphill because there was nowhere to leave them. He was not equipped and he was not unequipped. He was carrying 12 arrows that needed pointing and fletching, a bow that was perhaps 2/3 shaped, a string that had been finished sometime earlier and stowed away. He was in the middle of the ordinary and permanent maintenance that goes with owning tools one has made oneself. The work is never completed, and it is only ever set down for a while. His stomach contents were examined in 2018 by a team including Frank Meixner at the Institute in Bolzano. They turned out to be unusually informative, and about half the material was fat. There was meat from ibex and from red deer, dried or possibly smoked, rather than heated to any great temperature. There was einkorn wheat in a form that had not been milled. There were traces of bracken. That is toxic, and which he may have been taking against the intestinal parasites already known to have been present in him. It was a substantial meal, eaten by a man who appears to have been provisioned for several days away. There is a detail in the quiver worth a moment of its own. The technical archaeologist Harm Paulson examined the two finished arrows closely and concluded that they were not made by the same person. The evidence is in the fletching, and that is because feathers are bound onto a shaft in a spiral. The direction of that spiral follows the hand of whoever wounded. On one arrow, the binding runs the way a left-handed worker winds it, and on the other it runs the other way. There is a second oddity, which is that the arrow with the longer tip does not properly fit the quiver in which it was found. So the man alone on that ridge was carrying an arrow that somebody else had made. That is a considerable amount of work to receive from another pair of hands. A shaft must be straightened with heat, and a point must be napped and fixed with birch tar and bound. The feathers must be split and trimmed and wound so that the arrow turns in flight. That is because that turning is what allows it to strike anything at 40 meters. Whoever did it was sitting down at the time, indoors or beside a fire or in shade. That person was not walking anywhere and had not left any camp. The copper points in the same direction, and the ore behind that blade has been traced south into central Italy. The flint in his kit came from Trentino, and neither material was lying about on the ridge where he died. The picture of the deep past that most of us carry runs on self-sufficiency, with every man his own workshop. Here's a quiet argument against that picture, lying in the ice beside its owner, in the form of one arrow made by other hands. For a long time, the measurement of the outdoor half of the day was limited by the same thing that limited Lee. That is that one observer with a notebook can attend to one person. Ask that observer to also track a second person, walking in another direction, and the record quietly becomes an estimate. The camp scatters at sunrise in 6 directions and reassembles at dusk. The middle of the day is not recoverable by anyone sitting in the shade. Satellite positioning eventually removed that limit, at least for the part of the day spent walking. In the woodland around Lake Eyasi in northern Tanzania, there are a few hundred Hadza still living wholly on wild food. A team led by Brian Wood fitted them with GPS units and recorded 2,078 person days of movement. The result is not recollection and not impression. It is a set of tracks laid out on a map. Those tracks describe 2 different ways of using the same country. The men's lines run long, and they cover more ground, and they push into new ground as the days accumulate. They wander in the way that searching looks, when the searcher does not know where the animal is. The men are usually alone. The women's lines are shorter and straighter and more sociable. The women go out together and return together along nearly the same paths from one week to the next. That is because they already know where the food is standing. Neither of those patterns is a matter of temperament. Both of them are the food itself. A patch of berries or a bed of tubers stays where it is, so it can be approached directly and in company. An animal moves, so it has first to be found, and finding it is a wandering business best conducted quietly and generally alone. The division of labor is drawn on that map by the plants and the animals, rather than by anybody's preference. It is worth pausing on how little of this was recoverable before. Lee had 4 weeks, a pencil, and 1 pair of eyes. The team at Lake Eyasi had a constellation of satellites and a hard drive. Between those 2 positions lie 60 years of instrumentation, most of it aimed at the same half of the same problem, there is something else in the same data, which is that 2,000 person days of satellite tracking still stop at the edge of the camp. A device on a wrist records where a body went. It records nothing at all about what the hands were doing once the body had sat down. 6 decades of improving technology went into measuring with far greater precision the half of the day that was already visible. It remains reasonable to suppose that hunting was the center of the day, and there is real evidence behind that supposition. Meat is dense in calories, and it carries fat, which foragers seek out specifically and value above almost anything else. The men in these societies genuinely do spend their outdoor hours hunting, and the conference in Chicago was not given its title carelessly. The Hadza numbers are among the best that anthropology possesses. They were gathered by Kristen Hawkes, James O'Connell, and Nicholas Blurton Jones between 1985 and 1989. Their sample covers 256 days of observation. That works out to 2,076 hunter days. A hunter day being one man hunting for one day. Across the whole of it, the men of the study camps took 71 large animals, 71 out of 2,076, and that comes to roughly 3/100ths of an animal per hunter per day. Later work by Blurton Jones and others put the rate of large game kills below 1% of days. A man leaving camp with a bow each morning for 3 months might, on the more generous estimate, return with something once. On the stricter estimate, he might go an entire season. The animals themselves were large, and this is the part that tends to be left out of the retelling. Those 71 animals amounted to something in the region of 10,000 kilograms of live weight, which works out at just under 5 kilograms per hunter day. That is an excellent return by any measure. The Hadza deliberately ignore small prey, and the researchers demonstrated experimentally that including small animals would have lowered their overall rate rather than raised it. The strategy is therefore not irrational at all. It is a lottery with an unusually large prize, played by people who have understood the odds for a very long time. It is worth holding both of those facts together, because the retelling usually keeps only one. The hunting was genuinely skilled, and the returns when they came were genuinely large. The failures were also constant, and the two things describe the same practice. The odds do, however, determine the texture of a life. Nearly every one of those 2,076 days ended with a man walking back into camp carrying nothing. There was nothing to butcher and nothing to distribute, and nothing to show for a day of skilled and exhausting and expert work. Something fed those camps on all of those days. It was roots and berries and nuts and honey, and the hands that turned them into food. When meat does arrive, it arrives in the manner of weather, rarely and unpredictably, and in a quantity too large to keep. That is precisely why it is shared across the whole camp, rather than kept within a household. Hawks and her colleagues make that point directly. Sharing a large carcass is partly generosity, and it is also the only sensible response to more meat than one family can eat before it spoils. A hunter's own household, therefore, does not mainly eat what that hunter kills. It eats what the camp has pooled, and there is a technical observation that says the same thing from another direction. Kim Hill and Kevin Kintai worked out how many days of watching are required before a hunter's true average return can even be estimated. Among the Ake of Paraguay, who bring home game on nearly half of days, the answer is around 260 days. Among the Juhuansi, who succeed on fewer than a quarter, it rises above 600. Failure is sufficiently routine that it takes the better part of 2 years of continuous observation to see through it. Every measurement discussed so far has depended on somebody deciding what was worth writing down, and bone does not decide anything. Bone is living tissue, and it responds to load. Strain it repeatedly, and it thickens and curves and alters its density in order to carry the strain. Remove the strain and it gives the material back over time. A skeleton is therefore a record of what a body actually did, kept without the owner's consent and without any regard for what anybody called it. In November of 2017, a study appeared in the journal Science Advances that read that record in a way nobody had previously attempted. Alison McIntosh, then at Cambridge, worked with Ron Penhasi in Vienna and with Jay Stock. Their approach was straightforward, and they scanned the arms and legs of living women whose physical activity was known. That is because they had asked them and then measured prehistoric bones by the same method and compared the two. The living group included endurance runners, footballers, and rowers from the university crews. The rowers trained most days of the week under a coach with the specific aim of building upper body power. It also included ordinary students who did very little. The prehistoric group drew on Central European women across roughly 6,000 years, from the early Neolithic through to the early medieval period. The choice to compare ancient women with living women rather than with ancient men sounds like a small methodological decision. It was the reason the answer had remained invisible. Compare women's bones with men's, and one finds them less robust and concludes that women did less. Compare them with living women whose training can be measured and the floor falls out. The legs behaved as expected, and Neolithic tibiae came out close to those of the living rowers. Across the whole span, leg strength stayed near that of modern women who are recreationally active. The arms did not behave as expected. The Neolithic women in that study lived between 7,400 and 7,000 years ago. Their upper arm bones were stronger than those of the rowers by 11 to 16%, adjusted for body size. Set against the ordinary students, the difference approached 30%. It is worth restating that plainly. A woman who trains in a boat 6 days a week under professional supervision is among the strongest young women a modern country produces. The average farming woman of Central Europe 7,000 years ago had meaningfully stronger arms. Not one exceptional individual within the sample and the average of it, nor did the pattern fade as agriculture settled in. The Bronze Age women lived between 4,300 and 3,500 years ago. They still carried arm bones 9 to 13% above the rowers, while their leg bones by then were about 12% weaker. The legs come down and the arms hold across some 55 centuries of European farming. McIntosh is careful about cause, and that care is worth preserving. Bone records loading, and it cannot supply the name of the task. She identifies the likeliest candidate nonetheless, and it is not an exotic one. Grain is not food until it becomes flour, and for several thousand years, flour came off a saddle quern. That is a large, flat stone with a smaller stone worked back and forth across it by hand. The motion loads the upper arm in the manner the bones record. In the few societies that still use saddle querns, Women grind for up to 5 hours in a day. They do it every day for as long as anybody in the household eats bread. There is no coach in that arrangement, and no season, and no aim of becoming stronger. There's a task that has to be done today, and again tomorrow, and again the day after. The task begins in childhood and continues for the whole of a life, and the bones carry the record of every hour of it. There is an assumption folded into the ordinary question about what people did all day, and it sits in the second half of the phrase. The words all day carry a supposition that the waking hours were full, and that whatever happened, happened inside them. Stated aloud, it is an odd supposition. No animal is active throughout its waking period, and no worker in the economy ever has been. The other end of the day was measured in 2015 by a team led by Gandhi Yedish and Jerome Siegel. They fitted actigraphy watches to people in 3 societies living without electric light: the Hadza in Tanzania, the San in Namibia, and the Semeni in Bolivia. 3 continents, 3 languages, and no connection of any kind between them. The expectation had been that people without bulbs and screens would sleep long and deeply. That is the manner our bodies are commonly assumed to have been designed for. The 3 groups slept between 5.7 and 7.1 hours a night, averaging about 6.5. That sits at the lower end of what industrial societies report. They did not go down at dusk either. Sleep began around 3 hours after sunset and ended a little before dawn. It tracked the fall in temperature more closely than it tracked the light. 3 hours after sunset every night, spent awake in the dark beside a fire with no possibility of leaving the camp. There is a second implication in those figures, and it concerns the fire rather than the sleep. A fire burning 3 hours after sunset has to be fed. Somebody gathered that wood during the day, and somebody sits up with the fire while it burns. The evening is not empty time in a camp. It is simply time that no method has ever been designed to observe. It is not difficult to work out what can be done in that block. That is because it is the same set of tasks that has been running through this whole account. Fiber can be twisted by feel, and a net can be mended, a hide softened, a shaft smoothed, fletching checked, nuts cracked. All of it can be done in low light, in company, half inside a conversation. The hours that nobody counted, and the hours that nobody could see, turn out, in all likelihood, to be the same hours. The transition from foraging to farming is not something that happened once and finished. In some places it is happening now, which makes it possible to watch. In the north of the Philippines live the Agta. Some of their camps still forage entirely. Others have taken up rice farming to varying degrees. And the useful thing about that arrangement is that the comparison sits inside a single society. Comparing foragers in one country with farmers in another means comparing climates and soils and diseases and politics all at once. The subsistence difference disappears into the noise. Mark Dybel and his colleagues spent 2 years in those camps, at fixed intervals, from 6 in the morning until 6 in the evening. They recorded what each person was doing at that moment. The record covers 10 communities and 359 adults. They were not asking anybody how long things took, because people are poor at that everywhere, in every society. They were looking and writing down what they saw. The important departure from earlier work lies in what counted as an observation. A woman inside a shelter with an infant on her hip was recorded with exactly the same seriousness as a man walking out with a spear. The day fell into 4 categories: in work outside the camp, domestic chores, childcare, and leisure. The averages deserve to be as well known as Lee's figure: around 24 hours a week of work outside the camp, around 20 hours a week of domestic chores, around 30 hours of daylight leisure. The middle number is the one that matters here. 20 hours a week of work is carried out where people live. That very nearly equals the outside total, which every previous study had treated as the whole of work. That is the column Lee's method was unable to see, and somebody eventually put a figure on it, and the figure is large. The study was designed to test something else, and the something else is worth recording. Camps engaged more in farming worked around 30 hours outside the camp, while the foraging camps worked about 20, 10 hours a week, given up in exchange for agriculture. The loss did not fall evenly, and men's time barely shifted. Women in the more agricultural camps spent substantially longer working outside the camp, on top of the domestic hours they were already carrying. Their leisure paid for the difference. The largest change in the history of human subsistence, watched directly as it happens, appears to run on the same accounting as everything else here. The field was counted, and the camp was not, and the difference between those two things was written down afterwards as progress. It would be easy to finish this by making Richard Lee the villain of it, and that would be false, as well as ungenerous. Lee did not conceal the second set of figures. He went and found them himself, and published them under his own name, and argued in public about what they meant. That is what the work looks like when it is done honestly, and it is rarer than it ought to be. His original definition was also defensible. He set out to test whether the food quest was desperate, and for that question, the time spent acquiring food is the correct clock. The failure was never in his arithmetic, and other field workers, meanwhile, were returning numbers that did not match his at all. Kristen Hawkes and James O'Connell set the Kalahari figures beside their own from the Alyawara. That is a foraging group in Central Australia, living in a broadly similar habitat with broadly similar technology. They found the Alyawara spending between 2 and 5 times as long on the same basic business of getting fed. That gap was never fully resolved. The anthropologist David Kaplan wrote a paper about the whole affair and gave it the title, The Darker Side of the Original Affluent Society. His point was not that anyone had lied. His point was that one camp in one season had been asked to speak for the species. Of foraging is not a single occupation, and it is a different occupation in every landscape and in every month of every year. A figure gathered in 4 weeks of one dry season describes 4 weeks of one dry season. There is one further thing about Lee that belongs here, and it is the strangest part of the story. In December of 1969, he published an account in Natural History magazine of something that had happened to him in the Kalahari. He had bought an ox for the Christmas feast, choosing the largest animal he could find, and had been extremely pleased with the choice. Over the following days, a succession of people came to tell him. Each of them spoke with every appearance of sympathy. They said that the animal was a bag of bones, and that the camp would go to bed hungry. He went looking for a better ox, and could not find one. When the animal was opened, it carried a layer of fat 2 inches thick. He asked afterwards why a man who had just fed the entire camp would be insulted for it. The answer he was given came down to a single word, which was arrogance. A young man who kills a great deal of meat begins to think of himself as a big man. A big man treats other people as lesser, and so the camp takes the meat and withholds the credit. The larger the contribution, the harder the mockery. That article became one of the most reprinted pieces anthropology has produced. He had already been shown, at his own expense and in public, how these people handled contribution. They ran a deliberate and universal system for concealing the value of what was brought in. He understood it well enough to write it up. He then recorded that same camp's own account of its own work and carried the account home and published it as a number. It is worth setting down slowly and without hurry, where each of these people and things eventually came to rest. Marshall Sullins gave the phrase to the world in 1972. The original affluent society remains in print and remains argued over half a century later. He never claimed to have measured anything and said as much, and was reading another man's tables. Richard Lee published his revised figures in 1979 and defended them for decades afterwards. Even at 44 and a half hours, he held, the Zhuhuanxi came out ahead of the rest of us. On genuine leisure, he also published the account of the ox, 2 pieces of writing by the same man, and the world read the second and quoted the first. Kristen Hawkes, James O'Connell, and Nicholas Blurton Jones spent 2,076 hunter days establishing that the defining activity of the deep past succeeds almost never. Their data set remains the one that everybody cites. Alison McIntosh's scans put a number on 5,500 years of women's arms. Nobody has yet found the upper limit of what that work did to a skeleton. Bruce Hardy's fragment of cord sits in a laboratory in France, 6 millimeters of twisted bark, standing in for every rope and net and bag and binding that ever rotted away. The man from the ridge lies in a refrigerated case in Bolzano, more thoroughly studied than any other individual from prehistory. His bow is on a shelf beside him. 1 meter 82 of you worked from both directions. It still wants a shortening and a thinning and a polish, and 2 knocks cut for a string that was finished and stowed away. 53 centuries later, it is exactly as unfinished as it was on the afternoon he set it down. The women at the querns have no names at all in any of this, in any period or any of the societies described. That absence is not mysterious, and it was not a conspiracy. Nobody wrote their hours down because nobody was writing anything down. And by the time writing arrived, the shape of what counted had already been settled. What they have instead is bone. Thousands of upper arm bones in collections across Central Europe, each one carrying a record of load that no notebook ever kept. The camps themselves are gone in the sense that camps always are. A shelter of branches and grass returns to the ground within a few seasons. It leaves behind a scatter of ash and cracked nutshell and nothing else. The people who lived in them have descendants living now in Botswana and in Namibia. They do a great many things other than gathering mongongo nuts. The 2 stones survived as well, and they survived differently. A stone point is stone the whole way through. Dropped in a field, it waits patiently for 10,000 years, and then turns up behind a plow. It goes into a case in a museum. It photographs well, and it appears In the documentaries about our ancestors becoming clever, a quern is also stone, and that was the difficulty. It survived so plainly and so completely that people simply went on using it. Querns were built into walls and set down as doorsteps and used to weigh things and to prop things open. The object that carried the record of the most work was the object nobody thought to collect. And the country around the waterhole at Dobe, as much as it was, the mongongo trees still stand well apart from one another. They still drop their hard-shelled nuts across the sand in quantities that nobody planted and nobody tends. The light in the middle of the day is still flat and white. In the early morning, it is still cold enough to sit close to the fire until the sun has properly risen. Somewhere in the shade, a fire's kept going. A stone is set down on the ground, and a smaller stone is worked across it, and the sound carries a little way and then stops.